I am Jenny Gaynor. I'm with Grounded Solutions Network. We are a national nonprofit membership-based organization. Our members include organizations like community land trusts, other nonprofits, municipalities, folks who are looking at housing solutions that are going to be affordable for the long term with the goal of creating inclusive communities. So we're really excited to be here today, and I've got two amazing guest speakers who are going to dig into two specific applications of the cooperative model, but first I'm going to do just a high-level overview about cooperatives to kick us off. Cooperatives, I think the important thing to note here and remember is that cooperatives are a democratically controlled enterprise, and they're going to be driven by values and not just profit. Of course, they're going to want to maintain financial solvency, but you're thinking very much about your values behind every decision you're making as a cooperative. Cooperatives, I think the important thing to note here and remember is that cooperatives are a democratically controlled enterprise, and they're going to be driven by values and not just profit. Of course, they're going to want to maintain financial solvency, but you're thinking very much about your values behind every decision you're making as a cooperative. There are 7 key principles to cooperation that the International Cooperative Alliance puts out. And again, I think the thing to emphasize and think about when we're applying this to housing in these specific contexts are the ideas of democratic member control, the non-discriminatory open membership, the idea that people are going to be participating actively in their housing situation. So the housing cooperative is a legal entity that's going to own real estate. And I wanted to share just a few examples of how different these cooperatives can look. And again, Mark and Sean will dig in even deeper to how different they can look. But these 2 examples are actually on community land trust owned land in Burlington, Vermont. And so the Bright Street Co-op kind of looks like a traditional multifamily building. It's got 1, 2, and 3 bedrooms. But the Queensbury Co-op, it's a set of 18 duplex units. So again, just thinking that the co-op that's in your community might not look like what you have in your mind. So it could be a small home, it could be a really large community. It just will vary. And so, right, the legal entity that owns the real estate is owned by the shareholders. And so I think the important thing to emphasize again is that the shareholders are holding proprietary leases that's going to enable them and give them rights within their specific units. And then all of the shareholders are participating democratically to control the organization. Every member is going to have 1 vote, and they're going to be electing their board of directors, making decisions. There might still be a property management company, again, depending on the kind of building you're living in, but that property management company reports to you as the shareholder, as a member of the cooperative. So I wanted to quickly review some of the benefits. I'll go quickly over the economic benefits. Again, there are many nuances, but you can think of them as similar to homeownership in a way. There are many personal benefits, again, that you're going to gain by being a member of a cooperative, by owning your home collectively. But when we're thinking about this from maybe the municipality's point of view, some of the social benefits are really something to emphasize, something you can get out of this model that you might not get out of another affordable homeownership or affordable housing model in general. That sense of belonging, the measurable lower rates for vandalism and reported crime, that's a savings for your community, not only a benefit for the residents. And then similarly, you can be thinking about co-ops as an opportunity to fight against gentrification if you see it coming down the pike, if you see rising housing costs and want to maintain affordability for people who've been in your community for a long term, people who work in your community and don't need to be pushed out. I think there's a lot of opportunity. And then thinking again about the personal development, you're really supporting personal development of your community members who are going to contribute to your community for the long term.
I want to talk today specifically about the what is usually used as the affordable version of cooperatives, the limited equity model. The limited equity housing co-ops and co-ops in general just want to double down on the direct democracy nature of this, that it's one person, one vote. It doesn't matter how big of an apartment you have an equal say with your neighbors in how you run this thing. Ultimately, what makes limited equity models affordable is we're taking the cost of living, the value, essentially the value, the market value of this housing, and we're removing it from the speculative market. And we're saying that the community of residents will now decide what this is worth over time. And so we can establish a lower buy-in price or a moderate buy-in price and determine a formula that preserves that affordability over time. And we'll dig into that a little bit more. As I said, there are different ways of creating cooperatives, and they're all valid and they're all used frequently around the country. Market rate cooperatives are going to look more similar in how you, the cost of moving in and the cost of moving out and whatnot to like a condominium, but you do still have that direct democracy and that shared ownership. Limited equity models restrict the value of that over time. And so we're capping some of that wealth creation. And then there are also leasehold cooperatives, which are a little less common, where a group of people form a cooperative and master lease a property and usually take on a lot of the management and overall costs of that property away from the landlord and simply pay a simple master lease rent. Again, kind of the legal structure, the residents are going to create a corporate entity. That corporate entity is actually going to own the real estate directly. But that entity is owned and controlled and directed by the residents. And the residents essentially sign a lease with themselves, an occupancy agreement with themselves. And the joke is you become your own landlord at that point. And if you're complaining about the landlord at that point, you're complaining about yourself. So how do we start these things? How do we get this off the ground? If we want to create a new housing cooperative today, what does the financing look like? Well, this is a little bit simplified, but at the end of the day, typically, there is going to be a large mortgage. Maybe 60, 70, 80% of your costs might still come from a mortgage, but that mortgage is going to be to the cooperative corporation, not to the individuals. The individuals aren't signing themselves onto that mortgage. They, as a group, are signing onto that mortgage. And the important point there is that folks who have difficult credit for whatever reason, or don't have credit, can step into cooperative ownership in a way that you might not be able to step into other traditional home ownership, because you don't have to qualify for that big mortgage. You can collectively come up with a strong property management plan, an operating plan, a structure, and use that to present to your lender. That's the kind of financing that we do pretty regularly. The rest of the money that you would normally come from as you think your down payment as a homeowner, your 10 or 20 or 30% that you got to come up with, does still have to come from the residents, or sometimes comes from additional support or subsidies or grants from the outside world. But that usually defines this share price. So here we've got 3 different households. One of them has all the cash they need to buy their member equity. But sometimes people don't have all that cash, and you may have to turn to what you call a share loan to buy that share. And so often you're turning to credit unions or other institutions that understand the co-op model for those share loans, but those can be available. And then you're coming up with your equity at that point. But then in this permanent affordability structure, we have a decision to make. And there are pros and cons on both sides of that decision. You can either, on the left-hand side, restrict the value of that share over time to a very modest increase, or perhaps in some cases, almost no increase in value. And that means that today, buying into this housing co-op is going to cost the same as it does in year 10, in year 30, and year 50. You keep that bar very low to entry. But what you're giving up is wealth creation. So if wealth creation is more important, you might slide that share valuation decision a little bit further to the right, allow residents to walk away with a little bit of value when they leave, but then you're raising the barrier to entry each time. So that's an important distinction, and there is no right or wrong answer in that formula. It needs to be decided what's appropriate for the population you're working with, for the community you're working with, for what your community needs. Another way of looking at that is kind of thinking over time. You start out with a lot of debt and a little bit of equity in your home. As you pay down that debt, and usually in year 20 or year 40, you got to replace the roof or the boilers, and so you have to take on some more debt. So it's a little bit of a zigzag there. But over time, ideally, there is an increase in equity. And your decision around that formula is deciding how much of that equity is maintained by the community and held by the community versus handed over to the individual residents as they come and go. And so what's happening is in this formula, it's a fairly restrictive formula, but you do see some modest increase in wealth over time. What's in the middle there is truly community-held assets. No individual owns that. The group as a whole and the community decides what to do with that equity over time. And that's a very important thing over time because that ties into this shared sense of ownership in a broader way. This is an asset that we own together now that we can decide to invest in our infrastructure, take that asset and invest in our broader community, whatever we may want to do with that. These housing co-ops, as we saw, come in all shapes and sizes. These are just a few examples from the region around us here. We actually have the largest percentage of senior housing cooperatives in the nation here in Minnesota. We have a large number of other sort of smaller and modest-sized cooperatives, a lot of student cooperatives near the campus. They come in all shapes and sizes, everything from big shared houses to 750-unit townhomes that I've worked with all across the country. And I've lived in a variety of different cooperative models, and they all have their pros and cons, and every community is a little bit different because it's people defining for themselves what that community is going to look like. Just a quick touch on what can we do to support this model. And this is kind of some low-hanging fruit, is just thinking about what programs we have already in our communities to support homeownership and making sure that we don't accidentally exclude cooperatives from those resources. It is homeownership, so let's use our homeowner training programs and make them accessible to cooperative owners. It's the same skills, they're needed in both situations. Sometimes municipalities can provide some subordinate grants or subordinate loans if those resources are available. Sometimes when you're looking at these in the same way you might look at supporting other affordable housing, you may be able to reduce fees or permits in those situations to get these things off the ground, and that can sometimes make a big difference. That's up to you, of course, to decide how you use those resources. And then at the bottom, there's an approach that continues to gain popularity across the country and has been used very successful in a few different regions around the country, is this tenant first right of purchase or first right of refusal. So when a multifamily building goes on the market, this is an asset to your community, and what happens with that next buyer is important. So let's give the tenants that are already living in that building at least an opportunity to bid on that building. So it creates a certain period of time wherein the tenants can organize themselves and make an offer, just as any other buyer might make an offer on that property. And we found that that's been phenomenal in stabilizing housing for a number of people in different communities.
That's a state level legislative change that needs to be made here in Minnesota in order to allow for that, correct? Or are you telling me that municipalities have the authority to enforce or create that sort of environment?
It's typically a state level legislation that happens, but there are ways that municipalities can also influence that and establish procedures for that as well. So we could follow up and talk about variations on that.
My name is Sean McElhatton. I'm the Senior Development Director with North Country Cooperative Foundation. We're a Minnesota-based nonprofit organization that helps residents of manufactured home communities to organize, purchase their communities, and then operate them. We maintain relationships with community owners, manufactured home community owners across the state of Minnesota, indeed in the 5-state area. Whenever we find out that a park is available for purchase, we'll ask for financial information. We'll do an initial feasibility analysis to determine whether it's even possible for the residents to buy. If we conclude that it is possible, we'll negotiate a purchase agreement with the owner of the community, and if we're successful, then we organize a meeting of the residents, which is where Nativy Dodd started this morning. At that meeting, we'll present to the residents the opportunity, where we think they can get financing, the work that they'll be responsible for, where we think their rents are going to end up, and then we take a vote. And if 51% of the residents agree that they want to go ahead and make the attempt to buy their community, then we're with them and we're off to the races. If we don't get 51%, that's it. We terminate the purchase agreement and it's sold to somebody else. If the residents do decide to proceed, then we help them to form either a nonprofit or a cooperative, elect a board of directors, and then we work with that board of directors to do due diligence, to investigate legal title to the property, whether there are any environmental problems. We help them to hire engineers, surveyors. The engineers will evaluate the condition of the sewer, water systems, roads, any other shared infrastructure. We'll put together a reserve analysis so that we know we need to set aside this amount of money to meet the needs of the community, failing infrastructure, replacement of water lines, whatever they might be. We work with the residents to put together a budget, both an operating budget and acquisition budget. We work with them to establish a management plan so that they can manage themselves, collect the rents as they need to be collected. And usually that results in a successful purchase of the property. And then we stay involved with the residents after the purchase. So on an ongoing basis, we'll help them put together budgets, resolve differences among the directors, work with contractors to replace infrastructure systems, whatever needs they have. I want to talk a little bit just generally about manufactured housing in the state of Minnesota. There are about 1,000 manufactured home communities in the state. About 50,000 households live in those communities. 25% of the homes in Minnesota affordable to people at or below 50% of area median income are in our manufactured home communities. So that's a quarter of the homes affordable to people at or below 50% of area median income are in manufactured home communities. In every community in Minnesota, it's the lowest cost, unsubsidized source of housing. So they tend to be very low income residents. There is no home ownership gap in manufactured home communities. In the Twin Cities area, 96% of households of color own their homes in manufactured home communities compared to 93% of white occupied homes. So there's no home ownership gap in manufactured housing communities in the Twin Cities. They tend to be in very good school districts and have good accessibility. These are the communities that we worked with, 8 in Minnesota and 2 in Wisconsin that have successfully purchased their communities. We're currently working on one additional community in Wisconsin and one in Worthington, Minnesota. The manufactured home communities are scattered throughout the state. Every county but 2 in the state of Minnesota has at least one manufactured home community, so they're very likely to be in your communities. But it's a resource at risk. Most manufactured home communities have private infrastructure systems, private sewer, water systems, private roads. Those typically have a useful life of 30 to 50 years. Most of these communities were built somewhere 30 to 50 years ago, and those infrastructure systems are failing. In a condominium or townhome community, state law requires the owners association to maintain adequate reserves to replace those shared facilities. There's no similar law for manufactured home communities in the state of Minnesota. So I've never seen a community where there were reserves, where the money was set aside to replace those systems as they fail. Often the cost of replacement is 50% or more of the value of the property. So an investor owner often makes the rational decision that rather than put out all that money to replace a failing infrastructure system, they'll simply close down the community, kick everyone out, all that very affordable housing is lost, and they'll sell the land for redevelopment. So again, the typical manufactured home community in the state of Minnesota is owned by an investor. There's been a change in the industry. 20 years ago, most communities were owned by local people, some who lived in the community themselves. Most of the others lived in the broader community. Over the last 20 years, there's been a lot of consolidation in the industry. Now most manufactured home communities are owned by very large national owners or real estate investment trusts, and it's all about the income. There are 2 flaws with the investor-owner model. I mentioned infrastructure. Private infrastructure systems, no reserves, so when those systems fail, often the choice is to close the community. The other flaw with the investor ownership model is home appreciation. So there's the strongest component of any appreciation in any real estate asset is kind of the general market. Usually the market goes up. As we learned recently, sometimes the market goes down, but usually it goes up. In an investor-owned manufactured home community, when the broader real estate market values go up, the investor-owner captures that increment by raising rents. And so there's no appreciation in the homes that the residents own. In a resident-owned community, rents increase only as costs increase, and so gradually rents drop farther and farther below market. So it's perpetual affordability. As long as we set up adequate reserves, which we do when we work with a resident-owned community, those rents will become increasingly affordable in perpetuity. Those are the flaws with the investor model. Of course, the resident ownership model, where the residents collectively own the property. We set it, we create, we have an engineering study that determines the capital needs. We have capital reserves. We set aside money every month so that when the infrastructure system fails, the money's there to replace it. Because the rents aren't being increased to maximize profit to the investor, there is appreciation in the residents' homes. The greatest reward for the work that we do is what we call human capital development. So these are resident-owned communities, and when people, many of whom have very low incomes, very few have ever run a business, have experience with running a business. When you give those people an opportunity to own and operate a multi-million-dollar operation, and Natividad mentioned this morning, they're making the rules. They're hiring and supervising the management company. They're dealing with their neighbors who are racing their cars through the streets. But people grow into that role. Natividad is very active at the state legislature. We're affiliated with a national organization, ROC USA. ROC stands for Resident-Owned Communities. Natividad's on that national board, so she flies to New Hampshire a couple times a year. But it's just, people step up and do amazing things when they're given the opportunity to become, when they're given the opportunity. Where we could use some help, I mentioned infrastructure. And when we're not able to successfully work with the residents to buy a community, usually it's because the infrastructure is too far gone and the costs are too great to make the numbers work. 3 years ago, we lobbied the legislature to create a manufactured housing infrastructure fund, and that law was put into place with no funding. So we're back at the legislature this year to try to get some money put in that fund. Number 5 on the list is housing improvement districts. It might be a concept that some of you are familiar with. It's a state law that allows residents of condominium and townhome communities to petition their cities to issue bonds, which don't count against the city's volume cap, to replace failing common area improvements. We thought that the law was broad enough to allow residents of manufactured home communities to take advantage of the same law. We made that argument to the city of Sartell with a community that we were looking at buying about 3 years ago, and they said, we don't know, we don't think so, and we're not willing to take the risk. And as a result, we weren't able to make the numbers work, and that purchase fell through. But we're back at the legislature to make what we think is a clarifying amendment to the existing housing improvement district law that would say, manufactured home communities are among the people whose residents can petition the city, and then it's at the discretion of the city. The city may, at that point, establish a service district and issue bonds. They don't have to. Rent credit, infill. Many manufactured home communities in the state of Minnesota have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50% vacancy. So all these very affordable spaces with no homes in them for very low cost, ranging from $35,000 to $120,000, you can place a home in those communities. And again, residents can bear the lion's share of that cost, but it takes a little bit of subsidy to really make the numbers work for residents. We've placed about 75 new homes in resident-owned communities in the state of Minnesota over the last 10 years. We'd love to do many more, create more opportunities for to create the most affordable type of unsubsidized housing in the state. Rent credit parity, that's kind of a sore spot for us. In 2010, the legislature changed the property tax refund law to say that residents in resident-owned manufactured home communities can't claim the rent credit. So in the 1,000 manufactured home communities, 992 of those communities' residents can claim the rent credit. The 8 communities that are owned by the residents can't claim that rent credit. We were successful last year in having that bill passed by the legislature, but then was vetoed by the governor. We're back this year to try and see if we can get it through. And then acquisition funding. you know, probably 2/3 of the opportunities that we look at, we just can't make the numbers work. These are very low income residents, and there's a limit to how much. Usually if it's 15% rent increase, they can kind of deal with, they can stomach. But if it gets to be more than that, it's just people will lose their homes. I mean, they just can't afford to go higher than that. So for a little bit of money, $5,000 to $10,000 a unit would get us over that hurdle and allow us to help more residents become owners of their community.
We have a long history of cooperative housing in our state, in our community, and it got kind of a bad name. And I wonder if you could kind of speak to what we learned, how we can do this right, help us kind of learn from our past so we make a better future.
I think one of the biggest factors in success for housing cooperatives is technical support and kind of consulting and facilitation. So there's a lot of layers to running a successful housing cooperative. There is property management, which you can find property management folks to do that side. There's long-term kind of asset planning, and so thinking about that, folks that are new to home ownership, even single-family homeowners aren't often thinking about long-term asset planning. So that's a bit of a unique element. And then there's the democracy. How do we make decisions together? How do we work through conflicts and challenges? And how do we get everybody on the same page and move forward as a group? And that's another kind of skill that when you go through that and work through it reasonably well, it does lead to this individual development and broader community engagement, because people learn the skills of kind of small scale politics and how to navigate that, and people take those skills and move on. But most of us don't learn that anywhere in school, and so it helps to have facilitators or consultants to train on that, to orient people to that, and create some common skills around that. So that, in my experience, I've been working with housing co-ops for about 25 years now, and that seems to be the common denominator when it comes to cooperatives that fail, is lack of support. We do fortunately have some local technical experts, and there are national consultants and experts that can be brought in. It costs a little bit of money, so that's one thing. When I'm financing and underwriting a cooperative, I'm going to look for that training and technical assistance line item in your budget. If it's not in your budget, it's not going to be real. So we want to work that into the long-term planning of the cooperative. So that's maybe the short answer.
I think on the senior cooperative side, it feels that there's some solid financial institutions and backing on that. But what's the state of the market for the financial institutions that are financing housing co-ops and the limited equity model?
Yeah. They're not everywhere. There are a number of loan funds around the country like ours that focus on cooperatives, and we work in close partnership with them all across the country to bring financing wherever it can be needed for the limited equity and the affordable models in particular. We work with all models, but it's the case, like market rate models can usually turn to National Cooperative Bank or a couple of other larger lenders that works into their models of financing. If you're limited equity or affordable, you're going to turn often to a CDFI, a community development financial institution of some sort, which is what we are and what some of our partner lenders are around the country. Senior housing, I mentioned we have a lot of it around here. It's a very successful model. Part of the reason there's continues to be growing senior housing, and there has been for the last few decades, is because it's one of the few housing cooperative programs that still exists at HUD. And so HUD can provide mortgage insurance and things like that for the financing of senior housing cooperatives, but programs they used to have, for the most part, have dried up and are not available for other cooperative models.
If I may, Mark, so I mentioned that we're part of this nationwide network, the Rock USA network. An affiliated entity is the Rock Capital. So this is a financial institution that makes loans to resident-owned communities. They're a very strong, they have a very low default rate across the portfolio, partly because they're making loans to resident-owned communities, and they're secured by the land. But in fact, they're secured by the land and all the homes on that land, because if there's a default in that loan, the residents are at risk of the land being sold to a developer who will kick them all out. So that's one reason why there's such a low default rate across the Rock Capital portfolio.
When you were talking about one of the advantages is that someone with no credit or low credit in the cooperative, it has an opportunity for ownership. And then looking at the shared equity model, being able to balance that wealth building with the affordability. if a decision is made to go more on the wealth building side, what, in your experience, have you seen barriers for the next owner of that cooperative? And does that next owner have to have the credit and all those pieces?
Yeah, if you're setting your share price high enough that your target population is going to almost always have to turn to a share loan to buy in, then you do run up against that credit issue again for the individual folks. If you can set the share price low enough so that most folks might have that cash in their pocket, or they might be able to turn to friends and family for that money, then of course, you know, you're going to be able to avoid that credit issue and some of those related issues. And that becomes then sometimes an issue initially of, can we find a little bit of subsidy during the initial formation of the cooperative to bring down the share price? You're still going to borrow that mortgage. It's going to max out at a certain point. So the gap to fill is how can we lower that share price up front? Typically, if we're looking at very low income populations that we're targeting, we're going to look more on the end of the spectrum where the share price almost looks like a slightly large security deposit. And it's going to be treated very similarly, but it is a true purchase of shares. And so if you're looking at sort of people at 80% AMI or above, then you may have a more sizable share price. Once a co-op is established, rarely, but sometimes when you're first starting them out, some cooperatives can create enough internal cash, working capital, to allow sort of internal financing for those. So if most people have purchased their share, but a couple people don't have enough, you make a down payment on your share, and we'll take something out of every month's rent to pay towards that share. That's not easily done by every co-op, but that sometimes can be done. Yeah, a question around setting income restrictions. Normally, there are not income restrictions per se unless you are tapping public financing of some sort. Our approach at Shared Capital is we can sometimes reduce the interest rate a little bit or stretch on the loan to value of the financing if you are targeting certain incomes and you're setting that independently of an outside entity. So we encourage that. But often folks aren't setting a specific fixed target income unless they have a large mission motivation to do that, or they have their financing requires it.
So I wanted to ask if there are any local, and if not, maybe, or in addition to national examples of existing naturally occurring affordable multifamily housing or NOAA housing that use the cooperative conversion model to retain its affordability.
Yeah, there are a number of examples, both locally and nationally, and I've worked with quite a few folks as sort of housing preservation approach. I did a lot of work in the Chicagoland area and nationally around that. It sometimes takes a particular case for that to work unless you have a program and infrastructure to pursue that. Like we do have examples in Minneapolis, south side of Minneapolis, Park Cooperative Apartments was a story of a slumlord who sort of overcharged tenants, did not invest in the property, created a slum situation. There was tenant organizing campaign. They worked with the city and the state to bring financing to the table, purchased the property, stabilized it, turned it around, and turned it into affordable cooperative housing. And we actually have work that's going on right now around the state and in Minneapolis again in particular, recognizing that we have a lot of slumlords and there are opportunities to step in, organize the tenants, and turn it into stable housing. So we're engaged with that on a semi-regular basis around the country.